Now that we know a little bit about positioning, let's take our page and give it a 2-column layout. That is, I have a content div that has all of this text and some images, and I also have an author info area that is currently in the flow of the document, so it appears at the bottom of the page. What I'd like to do is take this author info and put it on the top left, and then have all of the content on the right-hand side of the page, and it looks like there's 2 columns coming down the page. So to do this, we're going to use styles. The first thing I'll do is come into the body and just reset all the padding and margin so that we don't have to worry about that messing up any of our calculations. And then I'm going to take the author info, and what we're going to do is take it out of the normal document flow. So we know one way to do that is to give it an absolute position, and let's say it's going to be absolutely positioned from the top by 5 pixels and from the left by 5 pixels. And if I save this and refresh, we now have about the author in the top left where I want it, but it's also overlaying the content area. We'll fix that in just a bit. Before we do that, I want to point out that it's often quite useful when you're trying to achieve some sort of specific layout to give your block some background color so it's very easy to identify them. So let's give author info a background color of yellow, and let's give the content area a background color of red. This is going to be very ugly, but it's also going to be temporary. And now I can see there's my author info block. One of the first things that jumps out is that I'm going to have to constrain the width of this so that content can appear on the right-hand side. I need to know exactly how wide that block is going to be. So let me go ahead and set the width to 300 pixels. One of the reasons I want that to be 300 pixels is because I know that this about the author is an image that has a width of 300 pixels. I want everything to match up. And now that I have author info under control, what I want to do is make sure that my content appears on the right-hand side of the page, and then it's not overlapping or underlapping where the author information is. And the easiest way to do that is with a left margin. So I'm going to say margin to the left should be 310 pixels to make sure it's away from author info and also has a little bit of margin. And we refresh that, we can see that is now moved over there. Let's get rid of the colors and see how this looks. And that would be a 2-column layout. So any additional information that I add into the author info area, that would flow down here on the left-hand side of the document. Any additional information I add to the content area, that's flowing down here on the right-hand side of the page. If we wanted the About the Author section to appear on the right-hand side of the page instead of the left, then you can imagine that we can just flip around some of the work that we did in the last piece. So I can take the absolute positioning and apply it to the content, and then take the author info and push it to the right a certain number of pixels. Now the content typically is going to need a little more space than the author info does. So let's set this to 400 pixels, and then author info can be moved to the left, let's say 405 pixels. And now you see that the two have reversed themselves. But still the image bleeds over a little bit into that right-hand side area. So we'll have to be really careful with this particular type of layout and make sure that the images have enough space to display fully. And actually this looks like it's going to be maybe about 600 pixels over. So let's make the width 600 and set this to be 605 pixels. And that looks like we have more than enough space now actually. For the next layout trick, let's say that we wanted to take this bit of information, this H1 tag, the author name and the date, and make it into a header that spans across both columns across the top. In order to do this, I'm going to make a slight structural change. I'm going to have to pull out that H1 and the paragraph tag outside of the content div and put it into another div. So I'm going to create a div called header, paste that H1 and P inside of there. If we just do that and refresh the page, you can see that things are starting to overlap. So this is one of the things you'll get used to in CSS. What we see is that we have a header up top, and to make it easier to see, let me go ahead and say that a header has a background color of red, and we'll go ahead and set a background color on our content again. You can also use the developer tools to do this to some extent, but sometimes it's just easier if you can see it right there on the screen. So what's happening is we have the header here up top, that's in the flow of the document. The author info is fine because it's in the flow of the document. It's statically positioned. It's going to appear after that header, but the content area is not in the flow of the document. It's being absolutely positioned. So we're going to have to make sure that we absolutely position it so that it's not overlapping the header. One way to do that is to give our header a specific height so we know exactly down to the pixel how much space it's going to occupy. So that's going to be 100 pixels. And now I can come down to the top and say, I really want to push this part, this content area, down 115 pixels. And now that's looking a little bit better. Let's make it 120. And let's take the background colors off so that it doesn't hurt the eyes. And now I have an independent header. So inside of here I could say text align to the center. And that header sort of spans our two columns. It's appearing right in the middle of the page. Now that we've seen how to do a 2-column layout, let's move up one level and try a 3-column layout. For the 3-column layout, I've introduced an additional div. It's full of links. And what I expect to do is have the links appear on the left-hand side of the page as one column, the content to appear in the middle of the page as a second column, and then the author information stays out here on the right as a third column. But in order to do this, I'm going to need to do a couple things. I'm going to need to take the links and move them out of the flow of the document so that I can pull them up here using absolute positioning to the top. So let's go into Styles, and let's say for links, I want them to be positioned absolute. I want it to be down 120 pixels from the top. Remember, we still have to leave room for the header. Left, we'll just move them over 0 pixels. And let me also set the background color so we can see exactly where they're showing up. Background color of yellow. And there you can see our links. That's about the position that we want them. But I do want to make sure that this has a specific amount of width. We don't need a lot of width, but we can expect there'll be some textual content in there that will need some space to display. And now what I can do is this middle bit of content, I'm actually going to switch it over to allow it to be in the flow of the document and take the author info out of the flow and push it up to the right. So author info now has an absolute position. It also has to be down from the top 120 pixels, but now off of the right, we're going to position it right up there on the right-hand side, and we can still make the width of 300 pixels. The content area, we'll fix that up next. Let me take the background color, though, and set it to red just to see how things are overlapping. So you can see now we have some absolutely positioned content here, some absolutely positioned content here. What I really need to do is squeeze this content area into the middle. And I can do that by setting a margin left. And we can bring it over 105 pixels to make sure that the links area can display. And a margin right. We'll set this to 305 pixels and refresh. And now you can see that content is squeezing in there nicely between those two. Let's get rid of the background colors. And refresh. And we have a 3-column layout. One of the questions you might be asking when you look at this 3-column layout is, could I achieve the same effect using floats? And the answer is yes, generally speaking, you can. It all depends on what trade-offs you're willing to make. It turns out that the 3-column layout is one of the holy grails of CSS design. everybody wants one, but we can never get 100% there. We can never have it behave exactly like we want it to behave under all circumstances. For example, with the absolute positioning that we've used, we can still run into a situation where if the user sizes the browser just right, you can have this image, which is very wide, start to overlap on some of the text or other content that's in the author info area. Now there are things you could do to try to solve that problem, like setting a specific width to that content area and then making sure all the images you have fit into that width. But for everything that you do to try to fix this, you lose something else. So if someone has a very large monitor and they're viewing this full screen and you've set the width of this content area to 450 pixels, then the page starts to look very small and there's a lot of white space on the screen. So everything that you do in CSS design, there's always some sort of trade-off when it comes to layout. But let's see how this would look using floats. What I want to do is say that the links are no longer using an absolute positioning. Instead, we want to float them to the left. Also, the author information, we're not going to use absolute positioning. We're also going to have it float to the left. And then finally, the content area will no longer need these margins. We want it to float to the left. And if I refresh the page right now, what we're going to discover is the content area is up here taking up all the space. Down here at the bottom of the page, we have the author information and the links, and they're reversed. I want the author information on the right. So of course, when you're floating things, the order in which the particular divs or things that you're floating, the order in which they appear in the document becomes significant. So if I want the links to be on the left, I need to place that div ahead of the content. And now if I save everything and refresh, we come to the top, there's our links, but notice that the content hasn't floated up beside it. And it's always instructive to set background colors to try to figure out some of the stuff. So let's set the background color of content to yellow. Let's set the background color of author information to be aqua. Let's set the background color of the links to be red. And refresh the page, and you can see that part of the problem is that this content area is taking up 100% of the width. So let's do this. Let's say that links should have a width of 100 pixels. Content should have a width of, let's make it 600 pixels. And then author info we know needs a width of 300 pixels. And now I refresh, and as long as the page is large enough, everything can appear next to each other. One of the advantages to the floats here is that if you have an image and it's very large, it's never going to bleed over into the author information on the right, but at the same time, just using floats, if there's not enough space on the screen, you might have something that moves to the bottom of the page. Now, there are some great sources on the internet. If you just go out to your favorite search engine and do a search for CSS, 3-column layout, you'll find dozens and dozens and dozens of approaches to trying to achieve a 3-column layout. And typically, you can run the code that someone is presenting when they're showing how to do a 3-column layout, and you can pick one of the layouts that works best for the content you're trying to display. In this module, we looked at positioning elements, and we discovered the position property has one of 4 values: static, relative, absolute, or fixed. The default value is static, which keeps an element in the flow of a document. Relative positioning allows you to move an element from its default position, whereas absolute and fixed positioning essentially allow you to place an element in a specific position in the document or in the window. We also looked at floating, which allows an element to move to the left or to the right, and for other content to then float up beside it in a normal flow. Clearing removes that float and prevents an element from floating. And then finally, we looked at a number of different layout techniques for 2- and 3-column layout. You can use absolute positioning to achieve this. You can also use floating elements. The choice you make really comes down to the content you need to display and how you want the page to behave.